The late autumn sun cast long shadows across Lancaster County's rolling hills as Sir Anthony Hopkins stood motionless in the doorway of a simple wooden church. Inside, voices rose in perfect harmony, pure, untouched by modern affectation. The acclaimed actor, who had portrayed kings and gods on screen, found himself transported to his childhood in Port Talbot, Wales, where his grandmother's gentle voice once filled their modest kitchen with ancient hymns. The Amish choir's melody floated through the air, a haunting reminder of something lost to time, but it was the final hymn that would shatter the careful composure of one of cinema's most celebrated actors, bringing him to his knees in front of everyone present. What could make a man who had mastered every emotion on screen break down in front of strangers? The answer lies in a story of two worlds colliding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey that led Sir Anthony Hopkins to that small Amish church began 3 days earlier, on a crisp October morning in Manhattan. He sat in his hotel suite at the Plaza, staring at the Central Park autumn colors through floor-to-ceiling windows, his fingers absently tracing the rim of an untouched teacup. The morning paper lay scattered across the antique coffee table. His latest film's reviews splashed across the entertainment section, all glowing, all speaking of yet another masterful performance. But Anthony felt hollow. At 83, he had achieved everything an actor could dream of: an Academy Award, knighthood, universal acclaim. Yet lately, he found himself haunted by memories of Port Talbot, the industrial Welsh town where his journey began. Particularly persistent were the echoes of his grandmother's voice, singing ancient Welsh hymns while cooking in their modest kitchen. The smell of fresh-baked bread mixing with the coal dust that seemed to permeate everything in that working-class neighborhood. "Sir Anthony?" His assistant's voice broke through his reverie. "The car's ready for Philadelphia." He had a speaking engagement at the Franklin Institute, another Lifetime Achievement Award, another speech about the craft of acting. But something inside him rebelled against the familiar routine. "Cancel it," he said quietly, surprising himself as much as his assistant. "Sir, the event is in 4 hours. I need—" He paused, searching for words that would make sense of this sudden impulse. "I need some air, some real air. Away from all this." He gestured vaguely at the Manhattan skyline. His assistant, Catherine Chen, had worked with him long enough to recognize these moments. In recent years, they'd become more frequent, periods when the weight of his public persona seemed to press too heavily on his shoulders. She'd learned to trust his instincts. "Where would you like to go?" Anthony stood, walking to the window. "Remember that piece we read about Lancaster County? The Amish communities?" Catherine nodded. They'd discussed it over breakfast a few weeks ago. An article about traditional Amish singing practices that had caught his attention. "It's only a few hours' drive from Philadelphia," he mused. "Perhaps it's time to see something real." Within an hour, they were heading west in a discreet black SUV, leaving the city's chaos behind. Anthony sat in the back seat watching the urban sprawl gradually give way to rolling hills and farmland. He'd insisted on wearing his simplest clothes, a plain black shirt, gray slacks, no tie. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. As they drove deeper into Lancaster County, the landscape seemed to shift backward in time. Horse-drawn buggies clip-clopped along the roads. Men in broad-brimmed hats worked in fields with manual tools. Women in plain dresses and bonnets tended to gardens. It was like watching a living museum, yet there was nothing artificial about it. They stopped at a small diner in Bird in Hand, a town that straddled the modern and Amish worlds. The waitress, a young woman named Beth, didn't recognize him. A refreshing change. Over a simple lunch of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, she shared stories about the local community. "The singing, though," she said, clearing their plates, "that's something special, especially on Sundays. Even if you're not religious, it touches something in your soul." "Where?" Anthony asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Where do they sing?" Beth pointed through the window toward a distant white building barely visible among the trees. "That's the Old Order Church. They have service tomorrow morning. She hesitated, though they're not too keen on visitors. That evening, in a family-owned bed and breakfast run by a former Amish woman named Hannah Stoltzfus, Anthony sat on a porch swing, watching fireflies dance over the darkening fields. Hannah brought him a cup of tea and, perhaps sensing his contemplative mood, sat in the adjacent rocking chair. "What brings a man like you to our quiet corner of the world?" she asked, her voice gentle with genuine curiosity. Anthony considered, deflecting the question, as he'd done countless times in interviews. Instead, he found himself speaking truth. "I've spent my life pretending to be other people. Lately, I've been wondering if I remember how to just be." Hannah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You know, my father used to say that God speaks, loudest in silence. That's why our people live this way, to hear those quiet voices." "My grandmother used to say something similar," Anthony replied, memories flooding back. "She said music was God's whisper in our ear. She'd sing these old Welsh hymns. I haven't thought about them in years." "Music stays in our bones," Hannah said softly, "long after we think we've forgotten it." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the farmland. In the distance, the clip-clop of horse hooves announced a buggy's passage, and somewhere a cow lowed softly. "Tomorrow's Sunday," Hannah mentioned casually. "The service starts at 7. They won't welcome you inside the church, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, if you stand quietly by the road, you can hear the singing." Anthony slept better that night than he had in months, lulled by the profound silence of the countryside. He woke before dawn, drawn by some inner calling he couldn't explain. As the first hints of light touched the eastern sky, he found himself walking along a country road, dew soaking the hem of his trousers. Buggies passed him, their occupants casting curious but not unfriendly glances. Children peeked out from under bonnets and hats, their eyes wide at this stranger in their midst. Anthony nodded respectfully but kept walking. The white church came into view just as the sun crested the horizon. It was utterly simple. No steeple, no stained glass, no architectural flourishes, just clean white walls and plain windows. Already dozens of buggies were parked in neat rows, their horses patiently waiting. He found a spot beneath an old oak tree, far enough away to be respectful but close enough to observe. Families continued to arrive, their quiet conversations carried on the morning breeze. An elderly man with a long white beard, who he would later learn was Elder Jacob Miller, stood by the door, greeting each arrival with a warm handshake. What struck Anthony most was the absence of performance in their interactions. In his world, every gesture, every word was calculated for effect. Here, people simply were. Their movements, their greetings, their very existence seemed unencumbered by the weight of observation. A young woman caught his attention, Sarah Yoder, though he didn't know her name yet. She carried herself with a grace that seemed both ancient and timeless, helping an elderly woman from her buggy. Their interaction was so genuine, so free of artifice, that Anthony felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. As the last families entered the church, a profound silence fell over the landscape. Anthony stood perfectly still, feeling like an intruder in a sacred moment. Then, through the open windows, the first notes of singing drifted out. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard in his decades of attending the world's greatest concert halls. There was no instrumental accompaniment, no artificial amplification, just pure human voices raised in harmony, carrying melodies that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. The singing was both powerful and vulnerable, complex and utterly simple. It reminded him of something his grandmother once said about the old Welsh hymns. "They're not performed, love. They're lived." Standing there, in the growing warmth of the morning sun, Sir Anthony Hopkins, celebrated actor, knighted by the Queen, winner of every major award in his profession, felt tears running down his cheeks. Not from sadness or joy, but from a recognition of something authentic that he'd forgotten existed. He didn't know then that this moment was just the beginning. He couldn't have guessed that the final hymn would crack open something in his soul that all his years of acting had never touched. He had no way of knowing that his life was about to change in ways that would surprise everyone, himself most of all. Catherine found him there an hour later, still standing beneath the oak tree. She started to speak but fell silent when she saw his face. In all their years working together, she'd never seen him look quite like this, as if he'd witnessed something that defied all his experience of the world. "Sir?" she ventured finally. "Katie," he said, using her informal name for the first time in their professional relationship. "I think we're going to be staying here for a while." The service was ending. Families began emerging from the church, blinking in the bright morning light. Anthony watched them, particularly the young woman he'd noticed earlier, who was now helping to organize a group of children for what appeared to be choir practice. "There's something here," he said more to himself than to Catherine. "Something real. Something I need to understand." As if sensing his attention, the young woman glanced in his direction. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and she offered a small, curious smile before turning back to her charges. That smile, completely devoid of recognition or agenda, would prove to be another turning point in a story that was just beginning to unfold. The morning progressed, and Anthony remained near the church, now seated on a wooden bench beneath the oak tree. The children's choir practice had begun, their young voices carrying through the open windows with a purity that touched something deep within him. He noticed how the young woman, Sarah, guided them with gentle patience, never raising her voice yet maintaining perfect control over the group. Catherine had returned to the B&B to make some calls, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The autumn breeze carried the scent of freshly cut hay and wood smoke, so different from the artificial atmospheres he'd grown accustomed to in Hollywood and London's finest hotels. A small commotion drew his attention. One of the younger children, a girl no more than 6 or 7, had broken away from the group and was running toward him, her black bonnet slightly askew. Behind her, an older girl called out, "Rebecca, come back." But Rebecca was already standing before him, her bright eyes studying his face with unabashed curiosity. "Why are you crying?" she asked, her voice clear and direct in the way only children's voices can be. Anthony touched his cheek, surprised to find it still damp. "The singing," he answered honestly. "It reminded me of someone I loved very much." Sarah had approached now, her steps measured and careful. "Rebecca," she said gently, "we don't bother strangers." She turned to Anthony, her eyes downcast in a gesture of modesty, yet there was strength in her bearing. "I apologize for the interruption." "No apology needed," Anthony replied, finding himself adopting the measured pace of their speech. "The singing is beautiful. I've never heard anything quite like it." Sarah's eyes lifted briefly to meet his, and he saw intelligence and curiosity there. "It is our way of praising," she said simply. "Through song, we speak what cannot be said in words." The phrase struck him forcefully. It was almost exactly what his grandmother had told him 60 years ago in their Welsh kitchen. Before he could respond, Elder Jacob appeared, his presence commanding quiet respect. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "the children are waiting." Then, to Anthony's surprise, he addressed him directly. "You've been standing here since sunrise." It wasn't a question, but Anthony answered anyway. "The music drew me. I hope I haven't caused any offense." The elder studied him for a long moment. "God's music speaks to all hearts," he said finally. "Even those who wear the English world's finest clothes." There was no judgment in his voice, merely observation. Rebecca tugged at Sarah's dress. "Can he stay for the special practice?" she asked. "He likes our singing." A complex series of expressions crossed Sarah's face: uncertainty, curiosity, and something else Anthony couldn't quite read. Elder Jacob's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a thoughtful look. "Perhaps," the elder said slowly, "you would like to hear more? The children are preparing something special for next week's harvest celebration." Anthony felt a surge of unexpected emotion. "I would be honored," he said, meaning it more than any acceptance speech he'd ever given. Sarah led Rebecca back towards the church, but not before the child gave Anthony a bright smile that reminded him painfully of his own daughter's childhood years. Elder Jacob remained, settling himself on the bench with the deliberate movements of age. "You're not just any Englisher," he said, using the Amish term for outsiders. "I may live apart from the world, but I know a famous face when I see one." Anthony nodded, feeling no need to elaborate on his identity. "Does that concern you?" "What concerns me," the elder replied, "is the look in your eyes when you hear our songs. It's the look of a man hearing something he lost long ago." The observation was so accurate it almost took Anthony's breath away. "My grandmother," he found himself saying, "she used to sing old Welsh hymns, sacred songs passed down through generations. When I heard your choir this morning—" "You heard her voice again," Elder Jacob finished for him. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the children's voices floating from the church. Sarah's clear instructions occasionally rose above the singing, patient and firm. "Sarah has a gift," Elder Jacob said. "Not just for music, but for seeing into hearts. She's been teaching our children since she was barely more than a child herself. Her father, my son, died when she was 12, but she never lost her music." Anthony absorbed this information, understanding it was being offered for a reason. "The song they were singing when I arrived," he said carefully. "It reminded me of something. An old Welsh hymn about harvest and God's grace." Elder Jacob's eyes sharpened with interest. "Our ways may be different from the English world, but true music knows no boundaries. Perhaps—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps there is a reason you were drawn here today." The children's voices swelled in a new song, and Anthony felt his heart skip a beat. The melody was hauntingly familiar, a variation of an ancient Welsh harvest hymn his grandmother had sung during autumn evenings. "That song," he whispered. "I know it." Elder Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his stern face. "Music has a way of building bridges where words cannot reach." Sarah found that tune in an old book her grandmother left her. "We've been teaching it to the children for the harvest celebration." Inside the church, Sarah was working with the children on a particularly challenging passage. Her voice rose clear and strong, demonstrating the proper way to shape the phrases. The similarity to his grandmother's singing was uncanny. "Would you—" Anthony hesitated, then continued. "Would you allow me to share what I know of this song? Its history, its original Welsh verses." The elder was quiet for so long that Anthony thought he'd overstepped. Finally, he spoke. "We live apart from the world for good reasons, Mr. Hopkins. But sometimes God sends us reminders that all his children share the same divine music." He stood slowly. "Come, let me introduce you properly to Sarah and the children." As they walked toward the church door, Anthony felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all his years of performing had been leading him to this moment of genuine connection. He didn't know yet about the remarkable events that would unfold over the next few days, or how this simple Amish choir would help him rediscover something he thought he'd lost forever. Inside the church, the afternoon light filtered through plain, glass windows, casting long shadows across wooden benches worn smooth by generations of faithful. Anthony followed Elder Jacob down the center aisle, acutely aware of the curious glances from 24 children arranged in neat rows. Sarah stood at the front, her hands clasped before her, the picture of composed grace despite the unexpected interruption. "Children," Elder Jacob's voice carried authority tempered with warmth, "God has sent us a visitor who knows something about our harvest song." The children straightened, their natural curiosity warring with ingrained discipline. Rebecca, the little girl from earlier, bounced slightly on her toes, earning a gentle touch on the shoulder from Sarah. "This is Mr. Hopkins," Elder Jacob continued, surprising Anthony with the simple introduction. "He comes from a place called Wales, where this song was first sung many years ago." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her composed facade cracking just enough to reveal genuine interest. "The melody in Grandmother Mary's book," she said softly. "It's Welsh?" Anthony nodded, moving closer to the group but maintaining a respectful distance. "May I hear what you've learned so far?" Sarah turned to her young choir. From the beginning, children. Remember what we practiced about breathing? The children straightened their shoulders, and at Sarah's gentle hand motion, began to sing. The melody started softly like a distant wind through autumn leaves, then grew stronger. Anthony closed his eyes, transported instantly to his grandmother's kitchen. The Amish children were singing in German, their pronunciation precise and clear, but the melody was unmistakable. Du Fi Nad, God my Father, a hymn as old as the Welsh hills. When he opened his eyes, he found Sarah watching him intently. The children's voices faded to silence, waiting for his response. Beautiful, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But there's a slight variation in the third phrase that changes its meaning. He hesitated, looking at Elder Jacob for permission. The elder nodded almost imperceptibly. May I? Anthony asked Sarah. She stepped aside, yielding her position with grace. Anthony faced the children, falling naturally into the role of teacher rather than performer. In Wales, this phrase rises here, he demonstrated with his voice, singing the Welsh words his grandmother had taught him. The sound of his rich baritone, shaped by years of classical training but carrying the authentic lilt of his childhood, filled the simple church. The children's eyes widened. Even Sarah seemed to forget her reserved demeanor, stepping forward with unconcealed interest. The rise in pitch, Anthony explained, represents the lifting of hands in gratitude during harvest. Each note carries a specific meaning. He turned to Sarah. Your grandmother's version is beautiful, but knowing the original intention might add deeper meaning to your performance. Sarah's face lit up with understanding. Like our work songs, she said, where the rhythm matches the motion of our hands in labor. Exactly, Anthony smiled, pleased by her quick comprehension. Each culture finds its own way to weave meaning into melody, but the fundamental truth remains the same. Elder Jacob, who had been watching this exchange with thoughtful eyes, cleared his throat. Perhaps, Mr. Hopkins, you would be willing to share more of your knowledge? For the children's benefit, of course. Anthony recognized the careful phrasing for what it was, a way to accept outside influence while maintaining the community's principles. I would be honored, he replied with equal care, if Sarah agrees. All eyes turned to the young choir director. She stood silent for a moment, her internal struggle visible only in the slight tension of her clasped hands. Finally, she spoke. Knowledge of God's music is a blessing, no matter its source. What followed was unlike any musical instruction Anthony had ever participated in. The children, initially shy, gradually warmed to his presence. He taught them the original Welsh pronunciations, explaining the meaning of each verse, while Sarah translated the concepts into German and related them to Amish traditions. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The children started blending the Welsh and German verses, creating a harmony that bridged centuries and cultures. Rebecca, particularly quick to learn, began adding traditional Amish vocal ornaments to the Welsh melody, creating something entirely new and breathtakingly beautiful. That's it, Anthony exclaimed, forgetting himself for a moment. Rebecca, sing that part again. The little girl complied, her clear voice carrying the hybrid melody. Sarah's eyes shone with unshed tears as she recognized the perfect fusion of their two musical traditions. Elder Jacob, who had remained quietly observant, suddenly spoke. There is a story, he said, his deep voice commanding attention, about our ancestors in Switzerland. When persecution was at its worst, they would sing their hymns in caves, blending their voices with other Christian refugees. Sometimes, they said, the mixing of different songs created a new music that seemed to come from heaven itself. Anthony felt a shiver run down his spine. He remembered reading about Welsh missionaries who had traveled through Switzerland in the 17th century, sharing their hymns with local congregations. Could this song have been part of that exchange? Before he could voice this thought, the church door opened and several women entered carrying baskets. Among them was Hannah from the B&B, who showed no surprise at finding Anthony there. It's time for the children's meal, Sarah announced, bringing the practice to a close. The children filed out in orderly fashion, though several, including Rebecca, cast longing glances back at Anthony. As the church emptied, Sarah approached him, her eyes downcast but her voice firm. Would you be willing to return tomorrow? There's so much more I'd like to learn about the song's origins. Anthony glanced at Elder Jacob, who gave a slight nod. I would be delighted, he replied. Hannah stepped forward then, her presence bridging the worlds between them. Perhaps Mr. Hopkins could join us for supper first. My table has room for another plate. The invitation was significant. A meal shared was a bond acknowledged. Anthony understood the weight of the gesture. Thank you, he said simply. That evening, seated at Hannah's plain wooden table with Sarah and Elder Jacob, Anthony found himself sharing stories of his Welsh childhood that he hadn't thought about in decades. He told them about his grandmother's kitchen, about learning the hymns while helping her bake bread, about the way music had been his refuge in a sometimes harsh world. But somewhere along the way, he admitted, I lost touch with that pure connection to song. Everything became about performance, about technique, about impressing others. Sarah, who had been quietly attentive throughout the meal, spoke up. That is why our singing remains simple. We sing not to be heard by men, but to be heard by God. Her words struck Anthony with the force of revelation. How many times had he stood on stages, accepting accolades, without feeling the genuine connection he'd experienced today with these children? As if reading his thoughts, Elder Jacob said, sometimes we must lose our way to truly find it again. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window they could see Thomas Fisher, one of the community's more conservative members, dismounting from his buggy. Brother Fisher seems concerned about something, Hannah observed, rising to clear the dishes. Elder Jacob sighed. There are those in our community who worry about too much contact with the English world, even when it comes through music. Anthony understood immediately. I don't wish to cause any discord in your community. Discord, Sarah said suddenly with unexpected firmness, can lead to stronger harmony if handled with grace. She colored slightly at her own boldness but didn't retract the words. Elder Jacob's eyes crinkled with suppressed amusement. Well said, Sarah. Well said indeed. The arrival of Thomas Fisher would prove to be another crucial turning point in the unfolding story, though none of them could have predicted exactly how. As Hannah went to answer his knock, Anthony caught sight of Rebecca peering through the window, her young face alight with hope for tomorrow's practice. In that moment, watching the interaction between these two worlds, his and theirs, Anthony felt something shift inside him. The hollow feeling that had driven him from Manhattan was being filled with something new, a sense of purpose, of genuine connection, of music rediscovered in its purest form. What he didn't know yet was that the next day would bring both challenge and revelation, as the full significance of the Welsh-Amish musical connection would come to light, and his presence in the community would spark a controversy that only music itself could resolve. Thomas Fisher's arrival at Hannah's house that evening marked the beginning of subtle but significant changes within the community. His tall, austere figure filled the doorway, his stern face betraying concern as he took in the scene before him. An English celebrity sharing a meal at an Amish table. Elder Jacob, Thomas began, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent more pronounced. In his agitation, the community is talking. Having an Englisher teach our children, it goes against our ways. Elder Jacob rose slowly from his chair, his authority evident in his measured movements. Brother Fisher, come, sit with us. Share some of Hannah's apple pie while we discuss your concerns. Thomas remained standing, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. With respect, Elder, this is a matter for the community to discuss privately. Sarah, who had been quietly clearing dishes with Hannah, suddenly spoke. The song Mr. Hopkins helped us with today, it's part of our heritage too. Grandmother Mary's book proves it. Mary's book? Thomas's expression shifted slightly. What does Mary Yoder's old hymnal have to do with this? Sarah disappeared briefly into another room and returned with a worn leather-bound book. its pages yellow with age. "May I show him?" she asked Anthony, who nodded, curious about this new development. With careful hands, Sarah opened the book to a marked page. The handwritten notes were faded but still legible, showing a musical score with annotations in both German and what appeared to be Welsh. "This was my grandmother's most precious possession," Sarah explained, her voice gaining confidence. "She told me it came from her great-grandmother, who received it from Welsh missionaries in Switzerland before our people came to America." Anthony leaned forward, his professional composure forgotten in genuine excitement. "May I?" he asked, reaching for the book. Sarah handed it to him with reverent care. The musical notation was crude by modern standards, but Anthony's trained eye could follow it easily enough. What he saw made his heart race. "This is extraordinary," he breathed. "These are original, Welsh missionary harmonies adapted for German texts. I've only seen references to such arrangements in historical records." Thomas Fisher's rigid stance softened slightly as curiosity overcame his initial resistance. "What do you mean?" Anthony looked up, his eyes bright with discovery. In the late 1600s, Welsh Protestant missionaries traveled through Switzerland and Germany, sharing their musical traditions with persecuted religious communities. Some of their hymns were adapted and preserved by these communities as they fled to America. This book, it's a direct link to that history. Elder Jacob nodded slowly. "Our ways may be simple, Brother Fisher, but they have always been enriched by God's providence, even when it comes through unexpected channels." Hannah, who had been quietly observing, added her own wisdom. "Remember what the scriptures say about entertaining angels unawares? Perhaps this visitor has been sent to help us understand our own musical heritage more deeply." Thomas Fisher sank into an offered chair, his expression troubled but thoughtful. "The elders will need to discuss this." "Of course," Elder Jacob agreed. "But perhaps first you should hear what the children learned today." As if on cue, voices drifted in through the open window. Rebecca and several other children had gathered in Hannah's garden, quietly singing the hybrid version of the harvest hymn they'd practiced earlier. The Welsh melody intertwined perfectly with their traditional German lyrics, creating something hauntingly beautiful. Thomas Fisher's face softened as he listened. "That's different from how we usually sing it. It's how it was originally meant to be sung," Anthony explained gently. "Your community has preserved something precious without even knowing its full significance." Sarah opened another page in her grandmother's book, pointing to a faded inscription. "Look here," she said. "Grandmother Mary wrote that these songs were meant to be shared, to remind us that God's music knows no boundaries." The evening deepened into night as they continued to explore the hymnal's contents. Anthony found himself sharing not just his musical knowledge, but stories of his own spiritual journey. How he'd lost touch with these sacred songs during his pursuit of fame, and how hearing them here, in their purest form, had awakened something long dormant in his soul. "In Hollywood," he admitted, "everything becomes about performance, about impressing others. But here, you're singing. It's a direct line to something higher." Thomas Fisher studied him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected from an English actor," he said finally. "Neither is this community what I expected when I left Manhattan 3 days ago," Anthony replied with a smile. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Catherine, Anthony's assistant, entered looking somewhat flustered. "Sir Anthony, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation. The press somehow got wind of your location. There are reporters asking questions in town." The peaceful atmosphere of the evening shattered. Thomas Fisher stood abruptly, his earlier concerns returning. "This is exactly what we feared. Publicity, disruption of our ways." But before the situation could escalate, Sarah spoke up with unexpected authority. "Mr. Hopkins came here seeking peace, just as our ancestors sought peace when they fled to America. Are we not called to offer shelter to those in need?" Elder Jacob's eyes twinkled with approval. "Well spoken, Sarah. Brother Fisher, Perhaps this challenge presents an opportunity. How we handle it could demonstrate the strength of our faith and traditions. Anthony turned to Catherine. How bad is it? Several entertainment reporters, a few photographers. They're staying at the local motel in bird in hand. Hannah, practical as always, offered a solution. The back road through Miller's farm leads to the old schoolhouse. It's empty now that we've built the new one, private, quiet, and far from prying eyes. A perfect place for the children's choir practice, Elder Jacob nodded. If, he added, looking at Thomas Fisher, the community agrees. Thomas sighed heavily. I will speak with the other elders tonight, but, he turned to Anthony, you must understand our concerns about protecting our way of life. I do, Anthony assured him. I give you my word. No publicity, no photographs, no media attention. This is about the music, nothing more. As the evening drew to a close, plans were made to move the choir practice to the old schoolhouse the next day. Catherine would handle the press, directing them away from the community with a carefully crafted story about Anthony's scouting locations for a future film. Before leaving, Anthony paused to study Mary Yoder's hymnal one more time. This book, he said softly, it's not just a collection of songs, it's a bridge between worlds. Sarah nodded, carefully wrapping the book in a cloth. Grandmother Mary used to say that music is God's way of reminding us that we're all part of the same human family. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Anthony arrived at the old schoolhouse early, following Hannah's directions down the quiet back road. The building stood in a clearing surrounded by maple trees, their leaves turning gold and crimson in the autumn light. Inside, the schoolhouse was simple but well-maintained. Wooden desks had been pushed against the walls, creating an open space. In the center, Sarah was already there, arranging chairs in a semicircle. Good morning, she said, her quiet voice carrying in the empty room. The children will be here soon. Their parents. She hesitated. Most of them have given permission for them to continue learning the songs. Anthony heard the unspoken message. Not all parents were comfortable with his presence. We'll make sure their trust is well placed. As they waited for the children to arrive, Sarah showed him more of her grandmother's hymnal. Each page revealed new connections between Welsh and Amish musical traditions, shared melodies, similar harmonies, even comparable notations for voice leading. Look at this, Anthony pointed to a particular marking. This is a Welsh musical ornament called a trill, but here your ancestors adapted it to match their own singing style. Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. Yes, we still use that in our slow tunes. We never knew it came from Welsh music. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their discussion. Rebecca led a group of children into the schoolhouse, their faces bright with excitement despite the early hour. Behind them came Elder Jacob and, surprisingly, Thomas Fisher. The elders have agreed, Thomas announced, though his tone suggested the decision hadn't been unanimous. The children may continue learning these songs, but with conditions. Of course, Anthony agreed immediately. Whatever you require. First, no recordings of any kind. Second, this knowledge stays within our community. And third, he looked directly at Anthony, you must help us understand how to preserve these traditions in our own way, without becoming dependent on outside influence. It was a fair request, one that showed both wisdom and foresight. Anthony nodded solemnly. You have my word. What followed was one of the most remarkable musical experiences of Anthony's long career. The children, freed from the formal atmosphere of the church, sang with pure joy. He taught them the Welsh pronunciations, while Sarah helped them understand how these ancient sounds complemented their German lyrics. Rebecca, proving to be a natural leader, helped the younger children master the complex harmonies. Her clear voice soared above the others, bringing tears to more than one pair of eyes in the room. Even Thomas Fisher found himself drawn in, sharing his own deep knowledge of traditional Amish singing. Together, they discovered how the Welsh missionaries had adapted their hymns to match the Amish style of worship, creating something unique and precious. As the morning progressed, more community members quietly appeared at the schoolhouse. Mothers, with younger children, elderly men who remembered similar songs from their youth, young people curious about this bridge to their musical past. Hannah arrived with baskets of food for lunch, and the practice evolved into a community gathering. Anthony found himself deep in conversation with the older men about the spiritual significance of certain musical phrases, while Sarah worked with the women on traditional harmony patterns. The afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as Anthony sat with Elder Jacob and Thomas Fisher, poring over Mary Yoder's hymnal. The children had gone home for their daily chores, but the excitement of the morning's musical discoveries lingered in the air. "Look here," Anthony pointed to a faded notation in the margin. "These markings, they're not just musical notes. They're ancient Welsh prayer symbols integrated with German religious annotations." Sarah, who had been quietly organizing sheet music nearby, moved closer to see. Grandmother Mary always said there were secrets in these margins, but she couldn't decipher them all. Thomas Fisher leaned forward, his earlier resistance softening in the face of historical evidence. "These symbols, they're similar to the ones in our oldest prayer books, because they share a common root," Anthony explained, his voice warm with enthusiasm. During the Protestant Reformation, persecuted communities often used musical notation to hide religious teachings. What you've preserved here isn't just music, it's a living historical document. Elder Jacob nodded slowly, his weathered hands tracing the ancient markings. "Our ways are built on preservation, on keeping faith with those who came before. But sometimes," he glanced meaningfully at Thomas, "preservation means understanding our heritage more deeply." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine, Anthony's assistant, her face tight with concern. "Sir Anthony, we have a situation. Someone leaked information about the Welsh Amish musical connection to the media. There's a PBS documentary crew requesting permission to film the story." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Thomas Fisher stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is exactly what we feared. Next will come tourists, photographers, more disruption to our way of life." "I gave my word," Anthony said firmly. "No publicity, no media. Catherine, please handle this." But Sarah, who had been quiet until now, surprised everyone by speaking up. Perhaps this is an opportunity, not a threat." All eyes turned to her. In the week since Anthony's arrival, Sarah had shown herself to be not just a gifted musician, but a thoughtful bridge between traditions. Now she stood straight, though her hands trembled slightly as she held her grandmother's hymnal. "Grandmother Mary wrote here," she turned to a specific page, "that these songs were preserved not just for us, but as a testimony to God's work across all peoples. If we hide this discovery, are we not burying the talent that was entrusted to us?" Elder Jacob's eyes crinkled with interest. "Speak your mind, child. What if," Sarah continued carefully, "we found a way to share this gift that respects our ways? Not with cameras or publicity, but through the music itself?" Thomas Fisher frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "A singing," Sarah said simply. "One time in the old way. We invite other communities, Amish, Mennonite, even Welsh choirs. No cameras, no recordings. Just voices joined in praise as our ancestors did." The proposal hung in the air like a held note. Anthony watched the others' reactions, understanding that this moment could either break or strengthen the delicate bridge they'd built. Elder Jacob stroked his beard thoughtfully. It would need to be carefully managed. The elders from all districts would have to agree. And it would need to happen soon, Catherine added practically, before the media attention grows too strong to contain. Thomas Fisher paced the room, his internal struggle visible. "Our young people already face so many temptations from the English world. This could open doors we can't close." "Or," Sarah countered gently, "it could strengthen their connection to our traditions by showing them the deeper roots of our music." Anthony had remained quiet, knowing this was a decision the community needed to make for themselves. But now he spoke, choosing his words carefully. "When I came here, I was running from the artifice of my world, searching for something authentic. What I found wasn't just music, It was a reminder of what I'd lost sight of in my own faith journey. He paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. Whatever you decide, that gift will stay with me. But consider this. If these songs helped one lost soul find his way back to genuine worship, might they not help others? Rebecca chose that moment to peek through the schoolhouse door, several other children visible behind her. "Is it true?" she asked, her young voice carrying clearly. "Are we going to sing with other communities?" Sarah smiled at the children's eager faces. "We don't know yet, Rebecca. The elders need to discuss it." "But the harvest song," Rebecca persisted. "You said it was meant to be sung in parts, with different voices coming together." Out of the mouths of babes, Anthony thought, watching Thomas Fisher's expression soften as he looked at the children. These young ones had embraced the blended traditions with pure joy, free from adult concerns about change and preservation. "Elder," Jacob stood, his decision apparent in his bearing. "I will call a meeting of the elders tonight. Brother Fisher, will you help me present this matter fairly?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "For the children's sake, I will try to keep an open mind." As the men prepared to leave, Sarah approached Anthony with an idea that would prove crucial in the days ahead. "Before they meet," she said quietly, "I think they should hear something." She gathered the waiting children, positioning them in their practiced formation. With a gentle hand motion, she led them into the harvest hymn they'd been perfecting. But this time was different. She wove in the Welsh harmonies Anthony had taught them, blending them seamlessly with traditional Amish singing. The effect was extraordinary. The children's pure voices filled the schoolhouse with a sound that seemed to transcend time itself. Rebecca's clear soprano soared above the others, carrying the Welsh melody while the lower voices provided the steady foundation of the German lyrics. Thomas Fisher stood transfixed, his hand gripping the back of a chair. Elder Jacob closed his eyes, swaying slightly with the music. Even Catherine, who had seen every kind of professional performance, wiped tears from her eyes. When the last note faded, silence held for a long moment. Then Thomas Fisher spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "If we do this, if we allow this sharing of traditions, it must be done in a way that honors both our heritage and the gift we've been given." Elder Jacob nodded solemnly. "We will find a way." That evening, as Anthony sat on Hannah's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, he reflected on the extraordinary turn of events that had brought him here. A week ago, he had been empty, going through the motions of his celebrated career. Now he felt filled with purpose, watching as these two musical traditions, his Welsh heritage and the Amish community's deep faith, created something new yet anciently true. Sarah joined him on the porch, carefully carrying her grandmother's hymnal. "The elders are meeting now," she said softly. "Whatever they decide, I want you to know something." She opened the book to a page he hadn't seen before. Grandmother Mary wrote this note just before she died. Anthony leaned closer to, read the faded handwriting. "To those who find these songs, they are not just notes on paper, but bridges between hearts. When voices join in praise, all walls fall away, and we remember that we are all God's children, singing our way home." The words seemed to hang in the evening air, a testament to the universal power of music to unite, heal, and transform. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Anthony and Sarah sat in companionable silence, waiting for word of the elders' decision, a decision that would set in motion events neither of them could have anticipated. The porch light flickered on automatically as darkness settled over the farmland. In the distance, the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves announced the return of buggies from the elders' meeting. Sarah straightened in her chair, her hands clasping the hymnal tightly. "Whatever they decide," Anthony said gently, "what's been discovered here can't be undone. These connections, these shared musical roots, they're part of your heritage now." Sarah nodded, but before she could respond, multiple buggies appeared on the dirt road leading to Hannah's house. Elder Jacob and Thomas Fisher led the procession, followed by several other community leaders Anthony hadn't met. Hannah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll put on some coffee," she said, reading the gravity of the moment. The men filed onto the porch, their faces serious but not stern. Elder Jacob remained standing while the others found seats on the various chairs and benches. "We have prayed," Elder Jacob began, "and discussed this matter at length. The decision was not easy, but it was unanimous." Sarah's grip on the hymnal tightened visibly. "The community will host a singing," he continued. "One day only, 3 weeks from now, during the harvest celebration. No cameras, no recordings, just voices raised together in praise as our ancestors did." The tension in Sarah's shoulders released slightly, but Elder Jacob wasn't finished. "However," he held up a weathered hand, "there will be conditions. Mr. Hopkins, we ask that you help us prepare in a way that honors our traditions. The singing will be held in the old barn at the Miller farm, away from public roads. Only invited. Communities may attend. Amish, Mennonite, and 3 Welsh choirs that you will personally vouch for." Thomas Fisher stepped forward. "We also ask that you help us document the historical connections properly, not for public display, but for our own records and teaching. Our young people should understand these roots." Anthony nodded solemnly. "I would be honored, and I know several Welsh musical historians who can help authenticate the historical documents without publicity." "There's more," Elder Jacob continued. "Sarah, the community has a special request of you." Sarah looked up, surprised at being addressed directly in this formal setting. "We ask that you take charge of preparing our young people for this event. Your grandmother Mary would have wanted you to lead this effort. Her wisdom lives on through you." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but her voice was steady. "I will do my best to honor her memory." Rebecca, who had apparently been eavesdropping from behind the screen door, burst onto the porch. "Can we start practicing tomorrow, please?" The solemnity of the moment broke as several of the elders chuckled. Even Thomas Fisher's face softened into a smile. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "But first we need to hear the song one more time, the full version, with both traditions combined." Sarah gathered the waiting children, who had been hovering nearby, hoping for just such a request. As the young voices filled the evening air with the harmonious blend of Welsh and German traditions, Anthony watched the faces of the community leaders. He saw in their expressions the same thing he had felt when he first heard these children sing, a recognition of something both ancient and new, a bridge between past and present. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The old barn was cleaned and prepared, with careful attention to acoustics. Word was sent to neighboring Amish and Mennonite communities. Anthony made discreet calls to select Welsh choir directors he trusted, explaining the unique nature of the event and the need for absolute privacy. Catherine proved invaluable in managing the growing media interest, crafting a story about Anthony taking time off for personal reflection that directed attention away from Lancaster County. She also helped coordinate the logistics of bringing the Welsh choirs to the area without attracting notice. But the real transformation was happening in the old schoolhouse, where Sarah worked tirelessly with the children. Under her guidance, they mastered the intricate harmonies that bridged centuries and cultures. Anthony watched in amazement as she intuitively understood how to blend the two traditions, creating something that honored both while becoming something entirely new. "You have a remarkable gift," he told her one afternoon as they reviewed Mary's hymnal together. "You understand music in its purest form, as a bridge between hearts." Sarah blushed at the compliment but continued her work with steady determination. "These songs," she said softly, "they're like prayers that have been waiting to be remembered. When we sing them together, it feels like completing something that was started long ago." As the days passed, more community members began attending the practices. Women brought quilting work, men took breaks from harvest preparations, and even the most conservative families sent their children to learn the songs. The music was working its own kind of magic, breaking down barriers and building new connections. 1. Evening, as they were finishing practice, Thomas Fisher made an unexpected request. "Could you teach us the Welsh words?" he asked. "Not to perform, but to understand." This simple request marked a profound shift in the community's approach to the project. It was no longer just about preserving their own traditions, but about understanding the deeper connections that linked their faith across time and culture. 2 days before the scheduled singing, as autumn winds swept across Lancaster County, an unexpected visitor arrived at Hannah's B&B. Dr. Meredith Lloyd, a distinguished Welsh musicologist from Cardiff University, had made the journey after receiving a cryptic message from Anthony about a remarkable historical discovery. Anthony met her on Hannah's porch, aware that her arrival could either validate their findings or complicate an already delicate situation. Dr. Lloyd, a small woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, carried a weathered leather briefcase that seemed to contain her life's work. "Sir Anthony," she greeted him formally, then switched to Welsh. "This better be worth crossing an ocean for." "It is," he replied in the same language, then gestured to Sarah, who had been waiting quietly nearby. "Dr. Lloyd, meet Sarah Yoder. She's the keeper of something I believe you've been searching for your entire career." Sarah stepped forward, holding her grandmother's hymnal carefully wrapped in cloth. Dr. Lloyd's eyes fixed on the bundle with intense interest. "Before we proceed," Anthony said carefully, "I need your word, as a Welsh woman and a scholar, that what you see here will be treated with the utmost discretion. This community's privacy must be protected." Dr. Lloyd nodded, solemnly. "You have my word." She turned to Sarah. "May I?" Sarah carefully unwrapped the hymnal and handed it to the scholar. Dr. Lloyd's hands trembled slightly as she opened the book, her eyes widening as she scanned the first page. "Good God," she whispered, sinking into a nearby chair. "This is it, the missing link?" "What missing link?" Sarah asked, sharing a concerned look with Anthony. Dr. Lloyd looked up, her academic composure cracking with excitement. "For decades, we've been trying to understand how certain Welsh religious musical traditions survived the persecution periods of the 1600s. We knew some missionaries traveled through Switzerland and Germany, but we lost track of their influence." She turned another page carefully. "This book, it's not just a hymnal. It's proof of a direct line of transmission." But then her expression changed, becoming more serious as she studied a particular page. "Oh my, this is unexpected." "What is it?" Anthony moved closer. "These markings here," she pointed to a series of symbols in the margin. "They're not just musical annotations, they're coordinates." Sarah leaned in. "Coordinates?" "Yes, geographical coordinates, hidden in musical notation. It was a common practice during religious persecution, hiding important information in plain sight." Dr. Lloyd pulled a magnifying glass from her briefcase. "And if I'm reading this correctly, they point to somewhere in this region." Anthony felt a sudden tension in the air. What exactly would these coordinates lead to? During the persecution periods, communities would hide their most precious religious documents and artifacts. Based on these markings, she paused, studying the page more closely. This could lead to a significant historical cache, possibly including the lost Welsh-German prayer book of 1682. Sarah gasped softly. She knew from her grandmother's stories that such a book existed, but its location had been lost to time. The implications of this discovery began to sink in. If word got out about historical religious artifacts hidden on Amish property, the community's peaceful existence could be severely disrupted. Just then, Thomas Fisher's buggy appeared on the road. Dr. Lloyd quickly closed the hymnal, understanding from Anthony's expression that discretion was crucial. Thomas approached the porch, his face concerned. "Sarah, the elders need to speak with you. There's been a development." At the community meeting house, they found Elder Jacob and several other leaders in serious discussion. A local newspaper lay on the table between them, its headline reading, "Historical Religious Artifacts Believed Hidden in Amish Country." "Someone talked," Thomas said grimly. "The reporters are already asking questions about old books and hidden documents." Elder Jacob looked troubled. "This goes beyond music now. If treasure hunters and historians descend on our community, it's already happening," Catherine interrupted, hurrying into the room. I've received calls from 3 major networks and several universities. Someone leaked detailed information about Welsh missionaries hiding documents in this area. Anthony felt a cold weight in his stomach. This was exactly what the community had feared, their private world being invaded by outside curiosity. Dr. Lloyd stepped forward. "If I may," she said carefully, "I might have a solution, but it would require trust on all sides." All eyes turned to her as she opened her briefcase. "I represent not just Cardiff University but also the Welsh Historical Trust. We have experience protecting religious historical sites while maintaining the privacy of current communities." She pulled out several documents. "We can establish a quiet, legal protection for any historical artifacts found here. No publicity, no tourism, just preservation and protection under both American and international law." Thomas Fisher shook his head. "Our ways don't involve courts and legal papers." "No," Sarah said suddenly, her voice stronger than usual. "But they do involve stewardship. Grandmother Mary protected these songs for a reason. Maybe we're meant to protect more than just the music." Elder Jacob studied Sarah thoughtfully. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah opened the hymnal to the page with the coordinates. "These markings, they're in my grandmother's hand. She knew about this. She chose to preserve this knowledge, waiting for the right time." Anthony watched the community leaders process this information. He could see them wrestling with their commitment to separation from the world and their duty to protect something of genuine historical and spiritual significance. Dr. Lloyd spoke again, her voice gentle. "In Wales we have a concept called cadw, not just preserving but keeping something alive and relevant. What you've done with these songs, blending traditions while maintaining their spiritual purpose, that's true cadw." Elder Jacob stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The singing is in 2 days. Many guests will be here from other communities. If word of these artifacts spreads, then perhaps," Sarah suggested, "we should find them first. Quietly, respectfully, and on our own terms." A long silence followed her words. Finally, Thomas Fisher spoke, surprising everyone. "Sarah's right. If these documents are part of our heritage, we should be the ones to protect them. But," he added firmly, "no cameras, no publicity." Dr. Lloyd nodded eagerly. "Of course, I can help authenticate anything we find and arrange for proper preservation methods, all while maintaining complete privacy." Anthony watched as the community leaders conferred quietly in Pennsylvania Dutch. He could sense the weight of their decision, not just about hidden artifacts but about how to maintain their way of life while acknowledging their connection to a larger spiritual heritage. Finally, Elder Jacob spoke. "We will search for these documents, but with conditions. First, it must wait until after the singing. Our community needs that closure. Second, only those directly involved will know the full story. And third," he looked directly at Dr. Lloyd, "any protection arrangements must respect our ways." Dr. Lloyd agreed immediately. "I suggest we keep this information among those present. The coordinates are complex enough that they can't be followed without the proper understanding of the musical notation system." But even as plans were being made, another complication arose. Rebecca burst into the meeting house out of breath. "English reporters," she gasped. "They're talking to families on the outer farms, asking about old books and Welsh missionaries." Catherine immediately headed for the door. "I'll handle them." "Wait," Sarah called. She turned to Anthony and Dr. Lloyd. "The singing, could we move it up? Perhaps tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" Thomas Fisher looked shocked. "The other communities aren't due until the day after." "The Welsh choirs are already in the area," Anthony said, thinking quickly. "They're staying in Reading, waiting for the appointed day. I could call them, and I can reach the nearby Amish and Mennonite communities today," Sarah added. "Most were planning to travel tomorrow anyway." Elder Jacob considered this option. Moving the singing forward would give us time to deal with these other matters privately, away from public attention. Decision made, the community sprang into action. Messengers were sent to neighboring farms. Catherine began calling the Welsh choirs, Hannah organized a group of women to prepare food for the unexpected acceleration of plans. As Anthony watched the efficient response to this crisis, he realized something profound was happening. This community, known for its resistance to change, was demonstrating remarkable adaptability while staying true to its principles. Sarah approached him as the others dispersed to their tasks. "There's something else," she said quietly, opening the hymnal again. "Look at these marks here next to the coordinates. They're not just directions to hidden documents." Anthony leaned in, studying the faded markings. "What do you mean?" "They're parts of a song, a very old one. Grandmother Mary used to hum it, but she never taught it to anyone. She said it wasn't time yet." Sarah's eyes met his. I think finding these documents isn't just about preservation. The song itself might be important." Dr. Lloyd, overhearing, joined them. In Welsh traditions, songs were sometimes used as maps. The melody and lyrics could contain coded information about locations or procedures. A new understanding dawned on Anthony. Tomorrow's singing might be more than a celebration of shared musical heritage. It could be the key to unlocking a centuries-old mystery. As the autumn day faded into evening, the community buzzed with purposeful activity. The old barn was prepared ahead of schedule. Meals were organized, accommodations arranged, messages sent and received. Through it all, Sarah worked with her young singers, preparing them for an event that had taken on new significance. In Hannah's kitchen that night, as final preparations were discussed, Anthony watched Sarah teaching Rebecca a particular phrase from the newly discovered song. The child's clear voice carried the ancient melody perfectly, though she couldn't know its potential importance. "Sometimes," Hannah said softly, noticing his observation, "God's plans are revealed in His own time. Perhaps all of this, your coming here, the discovery of the coordinates, even the threat of publicity, is part of something larger than any of us understood." Anthony nodded, thinking of his own journey from empty success to this moment of genuine purpose. Tomorrow would bring either revelation or crisis, but tonight, watching Sarah and Rebecca sing their way through an ancient mystery, he felt a deep certainty that they were all part of something extraordinary. As night settled over Lancaster County, another unexpected development unfolded. A second visitor arrived at Hannah's B&B, Dr. Evan Morgan, a historian from the British Museum, who had caught wind of the possible discovery. Unlike Dr. Lloyd's discreet arrival, Dr. Morgan came with an entourage, a research assistant, and a documentary filmmaker who immediately began setting up equipment in their car. Anthony met them at the end of Hannah's driveway, blocking their approach to the house. "I'm afraid you've had a wasted journey," he said firmly. "This is private property and the community isn't interested in publicity." Dr. Morgan, a tall man with an air of academic authority, smiled confidently. "Sir Anthony, surely you understand the historical significance of what's been discovered here. These artifacts could revolutionize our understanding of religious musical transmission during the persecution era, which is precisely why they need to be protected, not exploited," Dr. Lloyd said, joining Anthony at the driveway. Her presence seemed to surprise Dr. Morgan. "Meredith, what are you doing here?" "Ensuring that any discoveries are handled with appropriate respect for the community's wishes," she replied coolly. "Evan, you need to leave. Now." But Dr. Morgan stood his ground. "We have satellite imaging that suggests significant historical structures in this area, combined with the coordinates from the hymnal." Anthony's blood ran cold. How did he know about the coordinates? Sarah, who had been watching from the porch, suddenly walked down to join them. Her quiet presence commanded attention. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort with confrontation. "Our community has lived here for generations, tending this land and preserving our ways. Whatever history lies beneath our feet, it's part of our story too." Dr. Morgan's assistant was already taking photographs, but Sarah continued, "If you respect the history you claim to study, then respect the living tradition before you. These aren't artifacts to be catalogued, they're part of a living faith." The historian hesitated, clearly torn between his academic ambitions and the moral weight of Sarah's words. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching buggies announced the arrival of Elder Jacob and several other community leaders. "Is there a problem here?" Elder Jacob's deep voice carried authority without aggression. Dr. Morgan straightened. "Elder, I represent the British Museum. We're prepared to offer significant resources to facilitate a proper archaeological study of this area. And we're prepared to file immediate injunctions against any unauthorized research attempts." "Dr." Lloyd countered, pulling out her phone. "I've already contacted the Historical Properties Protection Office." Thomas Fisher, who had arrived with Elder Jacob, spoke up. "This is our land, our heritage. We will decide how to preserve it." The tension was broken by an unexpected sound, singing. Rebecca and several other children had gathered on Hannah's porch and begun performing the Welsh-German harvest hymn they'd been practicing. The pure voices carried across the darkening yard, bridging the confrontation with something more powerful than arguments. Even Dr. Morgan's documentary filmmaker lowered his camera, touched by the authentic beauty of the moment. Anthony watched understanding dawn on Dr. Morgan's face. This wasn't just about historical artifacts or academic papers. This was about a living tradition, one that had survived centuries precisely because it had been protected by people who valued faith over fame. "The singing is tomorrow," Sarah said quietly when the children finished. "You're welcome to attend, to listen and understand. But no cameras, no recordings, no papers, just open hearts and respectful presence." Dr. Morgan looked at his team, then back at the assembled community. Finally, he nodded. "We accept your terms, though I hope you'll consider allowing some form of historical documentation in the future. First," Elder Jacob said firmly, "we must find what has been hidden. Then, the community will decide how best to protect it." As Dr. Morgan's team departed, after Dr. Lloyd insisted on personally deleting any photographs they'd taken, Anthony realized that tomorrow's singing had taken on even greater significance. It wasn't just about preserving music anymore. It was about demonstrating how living tradition could bridge past and present without sacrificing its soul. Later that night in Hannah's kitchen, Sarah made an important discovery while studying her grandmother's hymnal with Dr. Lloyd. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of musical notes that seemed oddly placed. "These notes, they're not part of any song, they're numbers." Dr. Lloyd leaned in, excited. "Yes, it's an old Welsh coding system. The notes correspond to steps or distances." Anthony joined them at the kitchen table. "So the song isn't just a song. It's directions," Sarah finished. "Grandmother Mary didn't just preserve the music, she left us a map. But it can only be followed by someone who knows both the Welsh and German musical traditions." The implications were clear. Tomorrow's singing wasn't just a celebration or even a preservation of tradition. It was the key to unlocking a centuries-old mystery that could only be solved by bringing two musical traditions together in perfect harmony. As they prepared for bed that night, the autumn wind whistling through Hannah's eaves, Anthony reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. His simple search for authentic music had become part of a historical treasure hunt that could only succeed if handled with the same care and respect that had preserved these traditions for centuries. Dawn broke over Lancaster County with unusual activity for an Amish community. Buggies began arriving at the old Miller barn well before sunrise, their occupants working with quiet efficiency to prepare for the historic gathering. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh hay and wood smoke from Hannah's kitchen, where women had been baking since midnight. Anthony stood at the barn's entrance watching Sarah direct the placement of benches with the same gentle authority she used with her choir. The massive space had been transformed overnight. Lanterns hung from ancient beams, their soft light complementing the morning sun that filtered through deliberately open slats in the walls. "The acoustics are perfect," Dr. Lloyd whispered, testing the sound qualities of different spots in the barn. "Your ancestors knew exactly what they were doing when they built this," she added to Thomas Fisher, who was overseeing the final preparations. Thomas nodded, his usual stern expression softened by the growing excitement. "This barn has hosted Many singings, but none quite like this. The first Welsh choir arrived as the sun cleared the horizon. They came quietly, as requested, in unmarked vans, their formal performance attire replaced by simple, modest clothing out of respect for the occasion. Anthony greeted them in Welsh, explaining the importance of maintaining the community's privacy. "Remember," he instructed, "no phones, no recordings. Today we're not performing. We're participating in something far older than any of us." Sarah approached the Welsh choir director, a distinguished woman named Mrs. Powell, who had brought her own ancient hymnal. The two women immediately connected, despite their vastly different backgrounds, as they compared musical notations and discussed harmony structures. "These markings," Mrs. Powell said, pointing to a particular section in her book, "they match exactly with what you have. Our choir has been singing this version for generations, but we never knew its full history." More vehicles and buggies arrived, bringing Amish and Mennonite families from neighboring communities. Each group was quietly guided to their places, the logistics handled with remarkable efficiency by the community members. Hannah had organized a system where every arriving family was paired with a local host, ensuring that the barn filled in an orderly fashion that maintained proper separation between men and women, as per Amish custom. Catherine managed to keep the growing gathering hidden from prying eyes, strategically positioning local volunteers to redirect any curious tourists or media away from the area. Dr. Morgan had kept his word and not returned, but his presence the night before had heightened everyone's awareness of the need for privacy. As the morning progressed, Rebecca and her young choir members gathered in a side room of the barn for final preparations. Anthony watched as Sarah worked with them, her calm presence settling their excited nerves. The children wore their Sunday best, the girls in crisp white bonnets, the boys in dark suits that matched their fathers. "Remember," Sarah told them, "today we're not just singing songs. We're carrying forward something precious that's been passed down through generations." Dr. Lloyd, who had been studying the hymnal's coded messages throughout the night, pulled Anthony and Sarah aside during a quiet moment. "I've made some progress with the musical coordinates," she whispered. "The song you're planning to perform, the Harvest Hymn, it's more than just a combination of Welsh and German traditions. The harmony structure itself forms a kind of map." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "The way the voices come together at specific points. They're not just musical arrangements, they're markers. Each major harmonic convergence corresponds to a physical location on the property." Anthony glanced at the growing crowd in the barn. "How can we follow these markers without drawing attention?" "We don't have to," Sarah said suddenly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The singing itself will show us the way. Grandmother Mary wrote that when all voices join in perfect harmony, the truth will be revealed." Their discussion was interrupted by Elder Jacob's arrival. The old man's face showed both excitement and concern. "The barn is nearly full," he reported, "but we have another situation. More reporters have gathered on the main road. They're interviewing anyone who passes about old Welsh missionaries and hidden documents." Catherine joined them, looking worried. "They're speculating about everything from buried religious artifacts to secret underground chambers. Some are even talking about satellite imagery showing unusual ground patterns near the barn." Anthony felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They needed to proceed with the singing before outside interference could disrupt the community's peace, but they also needed to ensure that any historical discoveries were properly protected. "What time is it?" he asked Catherine. "Just past 8. The singing is scheduled for 9. Sarah touched the hymnal thoughtfully. "We should start earlier. Once the singing begins, nothing else will matter." Elder Jacob nodded in agreement. "I'll speak with the other elders. We can begin as soon as the last few families arrive." As they waited, Anthony observed the remarkable scene before him. The barn was filled with an unprecedented gathering: Amish families in traditional dress, Welsh choir members in their modest attire, Mennonite visitors from neighboring communities. All had come together, setting aside their differences, drawn by the promise of something extraordinary. Dr. Lloyd worked quietly in a corner, transcribing the coded musical notations while consulting with Mrs. Powell about traditional Welsh harmony structures. Their academic excitement was tempered by deep respect for the occasion's spiritual significance. Thomas Fisher, who had been checking the barn's perimeter, returned with news. "The last families are here, and," he hesitated, "there's something else." The children found something while playing near the old stone wall. Sarah's breath caught. What did they find? A carved symbol, very old, partially covered by earth. It matches one of the markings in your grandmother's book. Dr. Lloyd quickly opened the hymnal to a specific page. Here, she pointed to a musical notation. This symbol appears in the harmony line that Rebecca sings in the harvest hymn. Anthony looked at Sarah. Your grandmother knew. All these years the answers were in the music itself. Elder Jacob called for attention, his deep voice carrying across the crowded barn. The time had come to begin. Sarah gathered her young singers, their faces glowing with anticipation. The Welsh choirs took their positions, while the Amish and Mennonite families arranged themselves according to tradition. But before the first note could be sung, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the barn's open door they could see a group of reporters and photographers approaching, led by a local guide who had apparently decided that the promise of payment outweighed community trust. Thomas Fisher moved to close the barn doors, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "No," she said with quiet authority. "Let them come." All eyes turned to her in surprise. She stood straight, the hymnal held close to her heart. "They've come seeking a story about hidden treasures and lost documents. Let them witness something far more precious, the living tradition that has preserved these songs through centuries." Elder Jacob studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Sarah speaks wisdom. Our strength lies not in hiding, but in showing the truth of our ways, the way." Reporters entered the barn, cameras ready, but stopped short at the scene before them. The quiet dignity of the gathered community, the palpable sense of anticipation, the sheer power of the moment struck them into silence. Anthony stepped forward, his actor's presence commanding attention. "You may stay," he told the reporters, "but no photographs, no recordings. Today is not about documentation, it's about participation in something sacred." To everyone's surprise, the reporters lowered their cameras. Something in the atmosphere of the barn, in the gathered faces of three different communities united in purpose, spoke more powerfully than any photograph could capture. Sarah took her place before the assembled singers. Rebecca and her young choir stood ready, their voices prepared to bridge centuries of musical tradition. The Welsh choirs waited respectfully, their own ancient harmonies ready to blend with Amish hymns in a combination unheard since the days of persecution and hidden faith. Dr. Lloyd clutched her notes, understanding that they were about to witness not just a historical reconstruction, but a living continuation of something that had never truly been lost. The coded coordinates, the hidden symbols, the carefully preserved musical notations, all were about to come together in a moment of harmony that transcended time and culture. As Sarah raised her hands to begin the first song, Anthony realized that they stood at a crucial threshold. What happened in the next hour would either validate their discoveries or expose them to unwanted scrutiny. But looking at the gathered faces, seeing the trust and anticipation in their eyes, he knew that something more important than historical artifacts was about to be preserved. The morning light streamed through the barn's wooden slats, creating patterns that seemed to dance with anticipation. Outside, the autumn wind carried the scent of ripened apples and freshly harvested corn. Inside, 3 centuries of faith, music, and tradition were about to converge in a harmony that would reveal long-buried secrets and forge new bonds of understanding. Sarah's hands remained raised, holding the moment in perfect suspension. In that breath before the first note, the entire barn held its silence. Amish families, Welsh singers, Mennonite visitors, and even the chastened reporters, all waiting for something extraordinary to begin. Sarah's hands descended, and the Iur, first notes of the harvest hymn, filled the barn. It began with Rebecca's clear soprano, carrying the Welsh melody that Anthony had taught them. The sound floated pure and true in the morning air, touching something deep in every listener's heart. Then the Amish children joined in, their German verses weaving perfectly with the Welsh tune. The harmony was exactly as Mary's hymnal had indicated, not just musically perfect but carrying layers of meaning that seemed to resonate with the very beams of the old barn. As the first verse concluded, the Welsh choirs added their voices, bringing centuries of choral tradition to the blend. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the space with harmonies that seemed to transcend time itself. Anthony, watching from near the door, saw tears streaming down Dr. Lloyd's face as she followed the musical notations in Mary's hymnal. Tut! Reporters stood transfixed, their cameras forgotten at their sides. This was no mere performance. They were witnessing something that defied modern categorization. The pure voices, the perfect blending of traditions, the palpable sense of connection to something ancient and true. It was overwhelming. Then, something remarkable happened. As the singers reached a particular harmony that Sarah had practiced extensively with the children, a shaft of morning light struck the barn's back wall at precisely the right angle to illuminate a series of almost invisible carved symbols. Thomas Fisher, standing nearest to the wall, moved closer to examine them. His eyes widened as he recognized markings similar to those in Mary's hymnal. Dr. Lloyd quickly but quietly joined him, her academic excitement barely contained as she compared the wall markings to her notes. The singing continued, building in intensity. The next verse brought all voices together in a harmony so perfect it seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Rebecca's voice soared above the others, carrying the crucial Welsh phrases that Mary's notes had emphasized. As if responding to the sound itself, more symbols began to become visible on various surfaces of the barn, some carved into beams, others barely discernible on old stone foundations. They had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Elder Jacob moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, gathering the other elders. They understood now what Mary Yoder had done. She hadn't just preserved songs, she had maintained a map that could only be read when all the pieces came together in perfect harmony. The singing reached the crucial verse, the one that combined Welsh and German texts in a complex pattern of call and response. As the voices joined in this ancient dialogue, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. The shadows cast by the morning light through the barn's carefully placed openings were creating a pattern on the floor, a pattern that matched exactly with the musical notations in her grandmother's book. Anthony saw it too. While everyone else was focused on the singing, he watched as the shadows moved with the progressing sun, forming what appeared to be directional markers. Dr. Lloyd frantically scribbled notes, connecting the musical harmonies with the physical alignments happening before them. The reporters, sensing something significant but not fully understanding it, remained respectfully still. They had come seeking a story about hidden artifacts but found themselves witness to something far more profound, the living preservation of a tradition that had survived centuries of challenge and change. As the harvest hymn reached its conclusion, Sarah guided the singers into the final piece, the special song she had discovered in Mary's notations. This was the one they had practiced in secret, the one that combined Welsh musical codes with German prayer rhythms. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The combined voices created harmonics that seemed to make the very air vibrate at specific frequencies. Rebecca, singing the crucial descant line, hit notes that caused old glass in the barn windows to resonate sympathetically. Thomas Fisher, still examining the wall markings, suddenly called out in Pennsylvania Dutch. He had found something, a section of the old stone foundation that sounded hollow when struck. The singing continued as several of the elders quietly joined him. Dr. Lloyd, comparing her notes with the revealed symbols, realized that the musical pattern itself was a set of instructions. The harmony progressions matched perfectly with the shadow patterns, all pointing to specific locations within and around the barn. But it was Sarah who understood the final piece. As the songs reached their climax, she noticed how Rebecca's voice, carrying the Welsh melody, caused specific reactions in the barn's structure. The young girl's pure tones were activating something that had been deliberately built into the building itself. The singing swelled to its final crescendo, all voices, joined in perfect harmony. At that precise moment, as the sun reached its proper alignment, a beam of light struck a previously unnoticed crystal embedded in one of the barn's highest beams. The light refracted, creating a precise pattern that illuminated a section of the stone foundation. Elder Jacob, watching all of this unfold, raised his hand for silence. The singing ended, leaving a profound hush in the barn. In that silence, he spoke with quiet authority. What we have witnessed here is not just a joining of songs, but a revelation of our shared heritage of faith. Our ancestors built this barn, not just as a place for work and worship, but as a guardian of sacred knowledge. He turned to the reporters, who stood humbled by what they had witnessed. You came seeking a story about hidden treasures, but the real treasure has been before you all along, in the living faith that preserved these songs, in the community that kept these traditions alive, and in the hearts of these children who carry these melodies into the future. Thomas Fisher and several other men were already examining the illuminated section of foundation. With careful precision, they removed several loose stones, revealing a small chamber that had been sealed for generations. Dr. Lloyd, invited forward by Elder Jacob, helped them carefully extract the chamber's contents. There, wrapped in oilcloth and perfectly preserved, lay several books, including the lost Welsh-German prayer book of 1682, exactly as Mary's notes had suggested. But there was something else as well, a letter, written in Mary Yoder's careful hand. Sarah read it aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. To those who find these treasures, know that the greatest gift is not in these pages, but in the living harmony that revealed their hiding place. These books survived persecution because communities chose to protect each other, to blend their traditions rather than build walls between them. The songs are the key, not just to finding these documents, but to maintaining the spirit of unity that preserved them. Keep singing, keep believing, keep building bridges through harmony. Anthony watched as the impact of Mary's words settled over the gathered community. The reporters, understanding the significance of what they had witnessed, approached Elder Jacob. Sir, their spokesperson said quietly, we came for one story but found another. How would you like us to proceed? Elder Jacob looked at Sarah, then at Anthony, then at the gathered faces of his community. Tell the world that you witnessed a moment of living history, not in hidden documents, but in the voices of children carrying ancient songs into the future. Tell them that true treasure isn't found in secret chambers, but in communities that preserve faith through love and harmony. The reporters nodded, understanding that they had been part of something far more significant than a mere historical discovery. One by one, they left the barn, carrying a story very different from what they had come seeking. As the excitement settled, the various communities began to mingle, sharing food and fellowship. The Welsh choir members spoke with Amish families through translators, discovering shared experiences of maintaining tradition in a changing world. The children, led by Rebecca, continued to sing, their voices now relaxed and playful but still carrying the ancient harmonies. Dr. Lloyd worked with Thomas Fisher and other community leaders to properly document and preserve the discovered books, respecting their wishes about privacy, while ensuring these precious documents would be protected for future generations. But it was Sarah who perhaps best understood the true significance of what had happened. Standing with Anthony near the barn's entrance, watching the various groups interact, she said softly, Grandmother Mary didn't just leave us a map to hidden books. She left us a lesson about how tradition stays alive, not by staying isolated, but by finding harmony with others while remaining true to our core beliefs. Anthony nodded, thinking of his own journey from empty success to this moment of genuine connection. The real treasure was never in the hidden chamber, he replied. It was in the process of bringing these communities together, in the children, learning these songs in the bridges built through music. As the autumn day continued, the barn remained filled with song, sometimes Welsh, sometimes German, often both together. The children played games in the yard, teaching each other phrases from both traditions. The adults shared meals and stories, finding common ground in their shared commitment to faith and community. The discovered books were carefully transported to Hannah's house, where Dr. Lloyd and selected community members began the delicate process of documentation. The Welsh-German prayer book proved to be even more significant than anticipated. It contained not just prayers, but detailed accounts of how different religious communities had protected each other during times of persecution. Look at this. Dr. Lloyd pointed to a particular passage. It describes how Welsh missionaries and Anabaptist communities created a network of safe houses, using musical codes to communicate meeting places and escape routes. Sarah, who had joined them after ensuring all the visiting choirs were properly hosted, leaned in to examine the text. The same musical patterns we just sang, she observed. They weren't just preserving songs. They were keeping alive a whole system of community support. Meanwhile, in the barn, the celebration continued with a shared meal. Tables groaned under the weight of traditional dishes from both cultures, Amish bread and pies alongside Welsh cakes and bara brith. The children, still buzzing with excitement from their performance, darted between adults, their voices carrying snatches of newly learned Welsh phrases mixed with Pennsylvania Dutch. Rebecca had become something of a bridge between the communities, her natural musical ability and innocent enthusiasm breaking down barriers of language and custom. She sat with Mrs. Powell, the Welsh choir director, learning a simple Welsh folk song while teaching her an Amish children's game in return. Thomas Fisher, who had initially been the most concerned about outside influence, found himself deep in conversation with a Welsh choir member who, it turned out, came from a farming family. They discovered common ground in their discussions of land stewardship and maintaining traditional agricultural practices in a modern world. Elder Jacob moved through the gathering with quiet satisfaction, observing how the morning's revelations had transformed potential conflict into celebration. He paused near Anthony, who was watching the scene with similar appreciation. "You know," the elder said softly, "when you first arrived here, I worried you would bring unwanted attention to our community. Instead, you helped us understand our own heritage more deeply." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. "I came seeking authentic music, but found something far more valuable, a reminder of how tradition stays alive through genuine connection." The afternoon brought another unexpected development. As Dr. Lloyd continued examining the discovered documents, she found a series of letters that revealed a direct historical connection between the Welsh missionaries and the early Amish settlers in Lancaster County. "These aren't just parallel traditions that happen to intersect," she explained to the gathered community leaders. "Your ancestors deliberately worked together, using music as a common language to preserve their faith during persecution." This revelation led to a spontaneous moment of shared singing. The Welsh choirs and Amish families joined together in a hymn that both communities knew, though they had learned it in different languages. The harmony was imperfect, with some fumbling over unfamiliar words, but it carried a depth of emotion that touched everyone present. Sarah, watching this organic fusion of traditions, remembered something her grandmother had written in the margins of her hymnal. "True harmony isn't about perfect notes, it's about hearts beating together in faith." As the day progressed, practical matters needed attention. The discovered documents required proper preservation, and decisions had to be made about their future protection. Dr. Lloyd proposed a solution that respected both academic interests and community privacy. The books would be professionally preserved but remain in the community's possession, with limited access granted to serious researchers under strict conditions. "We'll create a proper conservation space in the old schoolhouse," Thomas Fisher suggested, surprising everyone with his forward-thinking approach. "That way we maintain control while ensuring these treasures are properly protected." The reporters, who had witnessed the morning's events, kept their word, publishing stories that focused on the living tradition of community and song, rather than sensationalizing the historical discoveries. Their articles spoke of the power of music to bridge cultures and the importance of preserving living traditions alongside historical artifacts. As evening approached, the visiting Welsh choirs prepared to leave. The farewell gathering in the Iine barn became another opportunity for shared singing, but this time with a difference. The songs flowed naturally between Welsh and German, with children and adults alike participating in both traditions. Rebecca led one final performance of the harvest hymn, but now it carried new meaning. Every harmony, every carefully preserved, Musical phrase was understood as part of a larger story of faith, preservation, and community support. Anthony, standing near the barn door as the sun began to set, felt the weight of what had been accomplished. They had not just discovered historical artifacts or preserved ancient songs. They had witnessed the renewal of a living tradition of mutual support and understanding between communities. As twilight settled over the farm, the practical implications of the day's discoveries began to take shape. Elder Jacob called a final meeting with the key participants: Anthony, Sarah, Dr. Lloyd, Thomas Fisher, and representatives from both the Welsh choirs and neighboring Amish communities. "We need to decide how to move forward," Elder Jacob began, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "These discoveries bring both opportunity and challenge." Dr. Lloyd spread out her preliminary documentation on Hannah's kitchen table. "The historical significance is extraordinary. The prayer book alone contains evidence of interfaith cooperation that rewrites our understanding of religious persecution in 17th century Europe. But that's not the most important part," Sarah interjected softly. She opened her grandmother's hymnal to a previously overlooked page. "Look at what Grandmother Mary wrote here. The books are precious, but the living tradition is priceless. Each generation must find its own way to keep the harmony alive." Thomas Fisher, who had been quietly contemplative, spoke up. "Perhaps that's why Mary Yoder waited to reveal these secrets. She knew we would need to find the right balance between preserving the past and protecting our present way of life." The discussion continued as darkness fell outside. Catherine managed the last of the departing visitors, ensuring that the media maintained their respectful distance. The children, though tired from the day's excitement, continued to sing softly in the barn, their voices carrying the newly learned harmonies into the night. Anthony watched as the community leaders worked out a detailed plan. The historical documents would be preserved in a specially prepared room in the old schoolhouse, protected by both modern conservation methods and traditional community practices. Access would be carefully controlled, with Dr. Lloyd serving as a bridge between the academic world and the community's privacy needs. But more importantly, they established guidelines for preserving the living musical tradition. The Welsh choirs would be invited back for annual gatherings, held quietly and without publicity. The children would continue learning both the German and Welsh versions of the songs, maintaining the dual heritage that had been hidden for so long. "It's like planting seeds," Rebecca observed unexpectedly from the doorway where she had been listening. "We're growing something old into something new." Her simple wisdom brought smiles to the tired faces around the table. Even Thomas Fisher, who had been the most concerned about changes to tradition, nodded in agreement. The meeting concluded with an unexpected proposal from Sarah. "The musical codes in these songs, they're not just about hiding places and secret messages anymore, but perhaps they can still serve a purpose," she explained her idea, using the traditional harmony patterns as a teaching tool, helping young people understand their heritage while preserving the community's values. The complex mathematical relationships in the musical codes could be used to teach everything from geometry to history, all while maintaining the spiritual core of the tradition. Dr. Lloyd's academic excitement was obvious. This could be a model for cultural preservation worldwide, showing how traditional knowledge can be maintained and transmitted without losing its essential character. As the night deepened, the practical details were settled. The Welsh choirs would return home, carrying with them not just memories but a living connection to a shared heritage. The Amish community would maintain its traditional way of life while embracing a deeper understanding of its historical roots. Anthony, watching the plans take shape, realized that his own journey had led him to something far more meaningful than he'd expected. He had come seeking authentic music but found himself part of a story about the preservation of faith, community, and human connection. Sarah approached him as the meeting concluded. "Will you come back?" she asked. "For the next singing?" "If the community wishes it," he replied carefully. Elder Jacob, overhearing, smiled. "You helped us unlock a door that had been closed for generations. But more importantly, you showed respect for our ways while doing so. You'll always be welcome here." The night ended with one final spontaneous gathering in the barn. The remaining visitors and community members joined in singing the harvest hymn one last time. The harmony was perfect, Welsh and German verses, blending seamlessly, ancient and new traditions finding common ground in shared faith and music. As the last notes faded into the darkness, Anthony looked around at the faces illuminated by lantern light. He saw in them something that had been missing from his life of professional success: genuine connection, living tradition, and the quiet strength of faith preserved through generations. Rebecca's clear voice rose in the darkness, singing a simple phrase that combined Welsh and German words. In harmony, we find our way home. 1 year later, Anthony Hopkins stood once again at the entrance of the old Miller barn, watching the autumn sunrise paint the Lancaster County sky in shades of gold and crimson. The past 12 months had brought changes both subtle and profound to this quiet corner of Pennsylvania. The old schoolhouse, now carefully restored, had become a discreet but important center for musical and historical preservation. Dr. Lloyd's careful management had ensured that the discovered documents were properly protected while remaining under community control. Serious researchers were occasionally permitted to study the materials, but only under strict conditions that respected Amish privacy and traditions. More significantly, the living musical tradition had flourished in unexpected ways. Sarah's choir program had expanded, with children from neighboring communities joining to learn the combined Welsh-German harmonies. The songs had become a bridge not just between past and present, but between different Amish and Mennonite communities who discovered shared heritage in the ancient melodies. Rebecca, now 11, had emerged as a natural leader among the young singers. Her gift for music had deepened, and she helped Sarah teach the younger children both the Welsh and German aspects of their musical heritage. Today, she stood beside Anthony at the barn entrance, her quiet presence a reminder of how much had changed, while essential traditions remained constant. "The Welsh choirs are arriving soon," she said, her voice carrying the same clear quality that had first caught Anthony's attention a year ago. "Sarah says we're ready for the new harmony." The new harmony was actually a recently discovered arrangement from Mary Yoder's hymnal, a complex piece that required singers to understand both Welsh and German musical traditions fully. Its debut would be the centerpiece of today's annual gathering. Inside the barn, the transformation was subtle but significant. The space remained simple, honoring Amish traditions, but now featured carefully designed acoustic elements that enhanced the natural resonance of the structure. Thomas Fisher had overseen these modifications himself, ensuring they remained true to community standards while serving their musical purpose. Hannah appeared with a basket of fresh bread, the morning light catching silver threads in her hair. "The first buggies are on their way," she announced. And Catherine called. The Welsh choirs just left Reading. Catherine had maintained her connection with the community throughout the year, helping manage the delicate balance between preservation and privacy. Her skilled handling of media interest had gradually turned attention away from sensational stories about hidden treasures to thoughtful pieces about living traditions and cultural preservation. Sarah emerged from the schoolhouse carrying her grandmother's hymnal, now properly restored but still in regular use. The book had yielded more secrets over the past year, not just musical notations but deep insights into how faith communities had supported each other through difficult times. "Good morning," she greeted Anthony with the quiet confidence that had grown in her role as guardian of these merged traditions. "Did you see what Rebecca discovered yesterday?" Anthony shook his head, and Sarah opened the hymnal to a newly examined page. Rebecca pointed to a series of musical notes that formed a pattern across the margins. "It's a star map," the girl explained excitedly. The notes matched the constellations that would have guided travelers between safe houses during the persecution times. Dr. Lloyd, who had arrived the previous day to help prepare for the gathering, joined them in examining the discovery. "Extraordinary," she breathed. They weren't just preserving music, they were maintaining a complete system of underground navigation. Thomas Fisher approached, his formerly stern demeanor now tempered by a year of witnessing how tradition could be preserved while embracing deeper understanding. "The elders have approved sharing this knowledge with other communities," he announced. "But in the old way, through songs and stories, not written documents. The morning progressed as visitors began arriving. The Welsh choirs came first, now familiar with community protocols. They were followed by Amish and Mennonite families from across Pennsylvania and Ohio, drawn by the growing recognition of this shared heritage. Elder Jacob, moving more slowly than a year ago but still commanding quiet respect, gathered everyone for the opening prayer. The mixture of Welsh and German words in his blessing reflected the natural blending that had occurred over the past year. The children's choir assembled, their voices joining in the harvest hymn that had first revealed the hidden harmonies. But now the song carried new depth, each singer understanding not just the notes but the history and purpose behind every carefully preserved phrase. Anthony watched as Sarah guided the choir through the complex harmonies. He remembered their conversation from the previous evening, when she had shared her grandmother's final journal entry, discovered tucked inside the restored prayer book. To those who carry these songs forward, remember that harmony is not just about different voices singing together. It's about hearts beating as one in faith, about communities supporting each other through dark times, about preserving light for future generations. The songs are your map home, whenever you feel lost. The morning's program unfolded with careful precision. The Welsh choirs performed ancient hymns that had survived centuries of change. The Amish children responded with their own songs, their pure voices carrying melodies that bridged generations. Then came the moment for the new harmony, the recently discovered piece that required both traditions to be fully understood. Rebecca took her position at the front of the choir, her young face serene with concentration. Sarah raised her hands and the first notes filled the barn. The harmony was unlike anything they had performed before, Welsh and German phrases interweaving in complex patterns that seemed to make the very air vibrate with meaning. As they sang, shafts of sunlight played through the barn's carefully preserved structure, creating the same patterns that had revealed the hidden chamber a year ago. But now these lights illuminated faces instead of secrets. Faces of children learning their heritage, of elders seeing traditions renewed, of different communities finding common ground in shared faith. Dr. Lloyd, watching from her place near the back, wiped tears from her eyes as she documented this living example of cultural preservation. Her academic papers on the discovered documents had brought her professional recognition, but she knew the real treasure was here, in the continuing tradition that gave those historical artifacts meaning. Thomas Fisher stood with his family, his youngest daughter now among the singers. The past year had changed him perhaps more than anyone. His initial resistance to outside influence had transformed into careful stewardship of how tradition could be maintained while growing in understanding. "You know," he said quietly to Anthony, during a break between songs, "I worried that all this would weaken our ways. Instead, it's helped our young people understand why we live as we do. They're not just following traditions, they're carrying forward something they understand and value." The afternoon brought another milestone. Sarah introduced a new group of singers, young people from various communities who had spent the year learning both the Welsh and German musical traditions. Their performance demonstrated how the heritage would continue, carried forward by a new generation that understood its deeper significance. As evening approached, the gathering took on a more informal tone. Families shared meals together, children taught each other songs and games, and the barriers between communities softened in the warmth of shared experience. Anthony found himself sitting with Elder Jacob on the same porch where their journey had begun a year ago. The old man's health had declined, but his eyes remained sharp as he watched the interaction between the various groups. When Mary Yoder sealed those books in the barn wall, Elder Jacob mused, she must have known this day would come. Not just the discovery of the documents, but this gathering of communities, this renewal of ancient connections. Do you think she foresaw all of this? Anthony gestured to the scene before them. Welsh choir members learning Amish hymns, children playing together across cultural boundaries, scholars and community leaders finding ways to preserve tradition while fostering understanding. Perhaps not the details, Elder Jacob smiled, but she understood something important, that true preservation isn't about hiding things away. It's about keeping them alive in ways that matter to each new generation. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit in the barn for one final gathering. The combined choirs, Welsh, Amish, and Mennonite, assembled for a performance that hadn't been planned but seemed inevitable. They sang the harvest hymn together, each in their own language but in perfect harmony. Rebecca's voice soared above the others, carrying the descant line that Mary Yoder had written so carefully in her notations. The pure sound seemed to connect, past and present, reaching across centuries of preserved faith to touch something timeless and true. Sarah, standing beside her young protégé, felt her grandmother's presence in every note. The hymnal she held, worn with use but carefully preserved, was no longer just a book of songs or even a historical treasure. It had become what Mary had always intended, a living bridge between generations, a guide for maintaining faith and community in changing times. As the final notes faded into the autumn night, Anthony reflected on his own transformation. He had come to Lancaster County seeking authentic music, running from the artifice of his professional life. What he had found instead was a lesson in how tradition stays truly alive, not through rigid preservation alone, but through thoughtful adaptation and genuine connection. The gathering concluded with a simple ceremony that had evolved over the past year. Representatives from each community added their voices to a final blessing, spoken in Welsh, German, and English. The words were different, but the meaning was the same: gratitude for heritage preserved, for faith maintained, for connections renewed. As the visitors departed into the night, their lanterns moving like fireflies across the darkened landscape, Sarah approached Anthony with a question that carried the weight of the future. Will you help us continue this? Not just the annual gathering, but the deeper work of keeping these traditions alive? Anthony looked at the faces around him: Rebecca's eager youth, Thomas Fisher's thoughtful determination, Elder Jacob's wise acceptance, Dr. Lloyd's academic dedication, all focused on preserving something precious while helping it grow. I will, he answered simply, for as long as the community wishes it. The night air carried the lingering echoes of harmony as families made their way home. In the old schoolhouse, the discovered documents rested safely in their new home, their secrets now part of a living tradition. Mary Yoder's hymnal lay open on Sarah's desk, its pages still yielding new insights to those who knew how to read its deeper meanings. And in the barn, where it had all begun, the autumn wind played through the carefully preserved structure, creating its own kind of music. A reminder that some songs never truly end, they just wait for new voices to carry them forward. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.